Okay, very good. So is there any question from any of the previous talks? Okay, yeah, Diksha, let's begin.
Okay. So, so what we did last time, we went to the Lagrangian formalism and we wrote down Suzy Lagrangian in a supersymmetric quantum mechanics system with n is equals to half supersymmetry. N is equals to half means one real supercharge. So, okay. So, what was the Lagrangian? The Lagrangian was given by half d phi I over dt, d phi I over dt, where this means there is a sum over I plus I by 2 psi I d psi I over dt, where psi I is a real fermion in 1D. So since the metric here, Gij, the metric that should have been sitting here, the metric Gij is basically delta Ij. So it's a sigma model from R, that is the from time t to a flat manifold Rn. I'm saying Rn because I'm taking n scalar fields. I goes from 1 to n. Okay. So we wrote down this Lagrangian and we saw, and I said that it is invariant under these transformation I epsilon psi I and delta psi I is equals to minus epsilon phi dot I. Did you guys check the SUSY transformation because you have to use the property that epsilon and psi are Grassmann, so there will be a negative sign when you interchange them. So if you have not done this exercise to check if delta L, so basically what you will find that delta L is d by dt of a certain quantity, and hence the action which is integral of dt of L and the variation in the action, since it's a total derivative, will be zero due to Stokes theorem. If you have not checked this, please check it once. And then what we said that the Noether charge, so the Noether charge was given by epsilon of q is equals to minus epsilon square root of 2 psi I phi dot I. Okay, now let's quantize the system. So till now I haven't quantized the system. I wrote a classical field theory action, and now I want to quantize the system. So what does mean by quantizing the system? So quantizing means I will impose commutator and anti-commutator relations. So initially in the classical system you have Poisson brackets, and when you go to the quantum system you promote those Poisson brackets to the anti-commutators and so on. So this I will do the same. So if in order to quantize the system, now let's find the canonical first. Let me find the canonical momentum corresponding to the boson for boson phi I. So what will be the canonical momentum? Let me denote it by Pi will be del L by del phi dot I. So from the Lagrangian, you can check that this is just phi dot I. And quantizing the system implies I impose commutator between the field and its momentum. I impose this commutator as iota times delta ij. Sorry, ej is equals to delta ij. I'm taking h close to be 1. So this is the quantization condition for me. And now, so this is for the bosonic part. Now let's see for the fermionic part. So the canonical momentum for fermion psi I. What is the canonical momentum? Let me denote it by pi I will be del L by del psi dot I. If you check from the Lagrangian, this you will get I by 2 psi I. Now notice that pi I is not independent in the sense it depends on psi I. It is proportional to psi I. So such systems are known as constraint systems. Constraint systems. So basically, when you so in your phase space, you have two n. If you have n dimensional system, you have two n phase space variables, which are basically the momentum. So you have the field phi and the corresponding momentum p, and for each field you have these two variables, and for the n dimensional system you have two n phase space variables. But now in this case, the momentum is basically proportional to the field itself. So instead of having two n independent phase space variables, you just have n phase space variables. So if the number of phase space variables is less than the 2n, then in that case, the system is known as constraint system. And quantizing such a constraint system is a bit non-trivial problem. So you cannot just directly promote the Poisson bracket to the commutator to quantize the system. You need to go to something called Dirac quantization. I will not go into details of what is Dirac quantization. If anybody is interested, there are lectures by Dirac himself. So if you just search on Google that Dirac quantization is lectures by Dirac, you will find there are very nice notes on Dirac quantization. So what basically you do, you need to take into account these constraints. So instead of going to Poisson brackets, you define a new bracket called Dirac bracket. And then you basically promote this Dirac bracket. You promote this Dirac bracket to the corresponding commutator or anti-commutator, depending on whether you are dealing with fermion or boson. So even for bosonic systems, you can have these constrained systems. Now I was considering a free fermion and I encountered a constrained system here. But you can have constrained systems both for bosonic as well as fermionic cases. And in that case, you need to define something called a Dirac bracket, and then you need to quantize the system. So I won't do that procedure here. But what you will find after Dirac quantization, so what you find for the fermions, you need to impose this anti-commutator. Psi I, psi j, anti-commutator is delta ij. So this is the thing you need to impose. Notice that I am imposing anti-commutator because it's a fermionic field, and as we saw in the previous lectures that for fermionic field, you need to work with Grassmann variables. Since you're working with Grassmann variables, the commutator will itself be 0. So you need to go to the anti-commutator. Okay. So this is the quantization condition for my fermion. Now notice, if you know, notice that this anti-commutation relation is followed by polymatrices as well. So if you remember polymetric algebra, what is the algebra? Gamma I, gamma j is minus 2 delta ij. It's eta ij if the targets, if I'm considering Euclidean space, so everything with plus signature, it will be delta ij. So you know this polymetric algebra, no? So polymatrices obey this algebra. Since polymatrices obey this algebra, we can parameterize the base space fermion psi I with target space gamma matrices. So what we can do, we can say that my psi I is equal to, let me just get the signs, minus I by square root of 2 gamma I. If you put this I by 2 square root of gamma I, you use this commutation relation, you will recover the psi I psi j commutation relation. I need I and square root of 2 to reproduce this minus 2 sign. Okay. So why I'm saying that gamma ij's are the target space gamma matrices, because the algebra on the right hand side of the algebra there should be the space time metric, and the target space metric was delta ij in our case. Remember here we saw that the gij, the target space metric, was delta ij. So these gamma matrices are the target space gamma matrices. Okay.
Sorry. So these fermions are not dynamical?
No, these are dynamical. Okay.
The-
It's a fermion. Its psi I dot is 0 basically from here. The equation of motion.
Right. Okay. So once we
Yeah.
fix them to be these gamma matrices, they just stay.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now let's look at the supercharge.
Oh, 1 minute. They stay, but they increase the vacuum degeneracy. So they do not have any time evolution because energy is 0, but they certainly contribute to increasing the vacuum degeneracy. Right? Because you can construct a Dirac operator out of 2 Majorana operators, and then using that you can construct degenerate vacuums, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't follow. Can you just explain it a bit?
So these operators are these are some fermionic operators, right? Which follows this algebra.
Right.
Now you can form a combination like psi1 plus I psi 2 and psi1 minus I psi 2. Okay. For example, if you have 2 of them, you can always do them if you have even number of them, and they follow the creation and annihilation relations just for fermionic, like B dagger anti-commutator is 1, BB is 0, and B dagger is 0. Okay, so they can act on the vacuum to give another state which has also same energy, because there is no, I mean, they're massless. There is, so it increases the vacuum degeneracy, but it doesn't have much dynamics.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Actually, this happens in general in string theory when you have fermionic. When you consider superstring theory, this is how you create states from the vacuum. And as Ananda explained, this is how the counting works.
Thank you.
Okay. So now let's look at the supercharge. Supercharge Q. So what was the supercharge? My Q was minus of square root of 2 psi I phi dot I. Now notice phi dot I is momenta is equal to the momenta pi, which I can write in the operator, which can be written in the operator formalism. So the momentum operator pi, I'm writing hat. I can write it as minus I times del by del phi I. This is how in quantum mechanics you write the momentum operator as a differential operator. So what is my Q operator now? So now the Q operator, let me substitute minus of square root of 2 psi I can parameterize by gamma I, and the momentum operator I can write it as minus I del by del phi I, which basically is gamma I del by del phi I. Notice that this is nothing but the Dirac operator of target space. Why? Because the target space coordinates are these phi's, no? Remember, phi was a function from here to here, and the coordinates of this space were phi i's. So phi I are the target space coordinates. So gamma into del by del of the coordinate, del by del xi, is the Dirac operator. So this is basically the Dirac operator d slash of the target space. It might be a bit confusing for you. So there are 2 spaces I have. One is the base space. So I am writing a sigma model from a base space to a target space. And now what I have shown, that the base space supercharge is equivalent to the target space Dirac operator. So one finds that there is a one-to-one correspondence between target space and base space quantities. So what I have shown, I'm writing here the base space quantity. On this side, I write the target space. So what I have shown that the base space supercharge Q is equivalent to the Dirac operator on the target space. Notice that this D slash operator is different than the D slash operator which was appearing in the fermionic kinetic term here. Because here the D slash operator has to be the D slash operator of the base space, which is just d by dt. The target space is my n-dimensional space. So the Dirac operator is gamma d by d phi I. Since it's an Einstein summation notation, there is a sum over this I. And now let's look at Q commutator. Since the supercharge Q was real, so Q dagger commutator, which was equal to the Hamiltonian, is basically QQ. This implies Hamiltonian is 2Q square. On this side, Q square will be basically D slash square. So the Hamiltonian is proportional to D slash square, and D slash square is sometimes known as Dirac Hamiltonian.
Is this part clear to all? It's a very interesting but important relation between two things. It helps us to compute many things. Some of them probably Diksha will talk about, but
yeah.
Is this part clear? Anybody has any question?
Ma'am, can you explain the gamma and the psi correspondence again? How the gamma matrices are related to the psi?
Yeah, okay. Okay, very good. So what we saw that when you impose the Dirac quantization, you find that the anti-commutators between psi's is given by psi I psi j equal to delta ij. And now we also know that the gamma matrices living in a space in a Euclidean in a space whose metric is delta ij. So the gamma matrix algebra is usually gamma j is minus 2 gij. Gij is the metric of the space on which gamma ij's are living. And let me for the moment take the space to be, let me take gij to be delta ij. That is my metric is like diagonal 1 1 1 up to n. So I'm taking the whole Euclidean metric. So then the gamma I, gamma j anti-commutator will be minus 2 delta ij. Now remember this delta ij was the metric of my target space. Because what was the metric of the target space from the Lagrangian? The thing that appears in the front of the kinetic term, the Gij metric, is the target space metric. And the Lagrangian we have considered, our Lagrangian Gij, in our Lagrangian Gij was delta ij. So these gamma ij's are basically the target space polymatrices. Since the anti-commutation relations are same, one can just parameterize these psi i's with gammas. And there is this factor in front to reproduce this minus 2. And hence psi i's can be parameterized by the gamma matrices.
Here both the psi i's and gamma i's are really living in the same target space, no?
No. Psi I was a fermion. So remember yesterday what we saw, the psi I had a spinor index also, alpha. And then if you remember, so psi I was a base space fermion. On base space, it was a spinor. It was a fermion. And then we counted the degrees of freedom of this fermion. We saw that for the Dirac fermion in one dimension, you have 2 degrees of freedom. So alpha can be 1, 2. So I had psi I1 and psi I2. This was my Dirac fermion. But then we imposed a reality condition because I was considering one real fermion, and I imposed that these two are equal, and I wrote this as psi I. So from the base space, psi I is a fermion. But if I look at the target space, from the target space, it has the index I of the target space, which is a vector index. When you do rotations in a target space, how psi will transform? It will transform like a vector. So it's a vector on the target space. Actually, since you guys are not familiar with GR, I am skipping one thing. The point is usually psi i's do not live in the target space. They live in the tangent space of the target space. So there is a index flat index A here, and you have to use VL binds and all. Since I don't know if you all have done GR course, so I was just neglecting that complication, and I was just writing psi I. So psi
Yeah.
I.
Diksha, it's better you skip that. I mean, even if they have done GR, not many of them will know VLBN. So skip that.
Yeah, so psi I are quantities which depend on the target space, but they don't live on the same space where phi's live. They live in the tangent space in a sense.
Okay.
Did I
Because
make
I
it
am
clear?
thinking that the psi's are really live in the target space because the phi's are the target space are in the target space. So I think the psi will also be in the target space.
Yeah, okay. You can think of it since they okay. For simplicity, you can think that they live in the target space. If you want to go into more details, you will find more structure, and you will see that actually there is some other refined structure, and psi I actually live in the tangent space of target space, not on the target space itself. But it's fine. I think you are understanding the basic concept easily, that the psi's are fermions, are spinors on the base space, but on the target space they are the vectors. So they depend on the target space quantity, and hence they can be parameterized by these gammas. Okay, is it fine?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So now let's see another thing. Remember the supersymmetric Hamiltonian we wrote in one of the lectures as H boson, as a matrix of H boson and H fermion. And I think the hydrogen atom lecture we wrote it in this way. So you can always diagonalize the supersymmetric Hamiltonian as this, and the eigenfunction psi you can represent it as psi boson, psi fermion. And now remember -1 power f operator. So it acts on psi boson to give you psi boson, and -1 power f acting on psi fermion gives you minus psi fermion. So you can write the matrix in the matrix notation. You can write -1 power f operator as 1, 0, 0, -1. Now let's go to the target space. This is about the supersymmetric base space. Let's go to target space. So on the target space, I have a Dirac equation. I found a relation between Q and the Dirac operator D slash. Now remember, in even dimensions, you can always, so if the eigenfunctions of the Dirac operator D slash acting on some psi, and this psi is different than this psi, so I'm denoting it is E psi. So this is so this psi is the eigenfunction of my Dirac operator. In even dimensions, you can decompose this psi into positive and negative chirality spinors, psi plus, psi minus. You can write it as this way, no? So this you can always do in even dimensions. And you can always define a chirality matrix. So let me just take a 4D example. So in 4D, if you remember, gamma 5 is called the chirality matrix, which is basically defined as I, gamma 0, gamma 1, gamma 2, gamma 3. And you can always diagonalize this chirality matrix, and it takes the form -1. This is a 2 cross 2 identity, and this is also a 2 cross 2 identity matrix. In any even dimensions, you can do this. So gamma 2n plus 1. So in 4 dimension, I represent as gamma 5. In any even dimensions 2n, the chirality matrix is represented as gamma 2n minus 1. Can be represented as identity and minus identity, such that when gamma 5 acts on this psi, so gamma 5 acting on this psi, what this implies that Gamma 5 on psi plus on positive chirality spinner will give you just psi plus, and gamma 5 on psi minus on the negative chirality spinner will give you minus of psi. So you can see that there is some correspondence between the -1 power f operator and the gamma 5 operator. Both have the same type of action. So what we find that the -1 power f operator of the base space corresponds to chirality matrix gamma 2n plus 1 on the target space. This is chirality. Is it clear? Okay, so now let's look at Witten index. What was Witten index? Trace over Hilbert space -1 power f exponential minus beta h. So what will it correspond in the target space? There will be a trace over the solutions of the Dirac operator. -1 power f is gamma 2n plus 1 exponential minus beta d slash square. So this quantity is a very important quantity, and usually it's required to compute anomaly. So anomaly is basically if you have a symmetry in your classical system, and when you go to the quantum system, that symmetry breaks down. And anomaly calculates how much that symmetry is breaking when you go from a classical system to quantum system. So this quantity is something you need to calculate for chiral anomaly. Sorry, I'm not going in the details. I'm just telling this to tell you one more usefulness of supersymmetric quantum mechanics. So basically, the Witten index of the base space is related to chiral anomaly of target space. And this is a very good correspondence, and this is one of the very important reasons, one of the very important place where high energy physicists use supersymmetric quantum mechanics, because it's usually very easy to compute this Witten index. And once you compute this Witten index, you can set a particular type of the target space, and then you can find the chiral anomaly in that target space. Remember, till now, what I have done, I had assumed that the target space metric was Gij. If instead of, delta ij, if instead of delta ij, I had any curved metric Gij, any general manifold, then you can still do the whole procedure. Here, what you will find the covariant derivative here. Here you will find the covariant derivative, and this d slash will be the covariant derivative. There will be the covariant derivative sitting here, because now I can have curvatures and all, and you can do the whole procedure, and this correspondence between the supercharge and Dirac operator still remains true. So even if instead of considering the flat space, flat target space, if you had a curved target space, the same thing would have happened. Okay, is it clear? So supersymmetry is useful in computing chiral anomaly for fermions. And it has been noted that this quantity Witten index, it has been noted, I'm not going into details how, that Witten index tells you something about topology of the target space manifold. So this quantity Witten index is also very important for mathematicians, because by computing Witten index for a certain target space, you can find some topological quantity of that manifold. So if I take a general target space manifold M, the Witten index tells you information about some topological quantity. More precisely, it's related to index theorems, but I don't have time to go into that. But so if any of you is more interested, you can go to Mirror Symmetry book. I think they have a chapter on index theorems in the Mirror Symmetry book, or even in Nakahara. Sorry, I don't remember if Mirror Symmetry book has that. Nakahara has it. So Nakahara, there is a chapter on index theorems. There you can see the relation between the supersymmetric quantum mechanics and topology. Okay. Now let's go to, is it clear? Any questions in this part? Okay. Let me now go to extended supersymmetry. So till now what we have considered? Till now we considered one real supercharge. So we had n is equals to half supersymmetry. But what happens if we have more? If we have more supersymmetry. Let me first do the case of n is equals to 1, Suzy. That is one complex supercharge and then for higher n is equals to 2, n is equal, up to so on, you can just generalize the discussion now. So instead of considering one real fermions in quantum mechanics, let me consider Dirac fermion. So remember, in the last lecture we did the counting and we showed that the Dirac fermion in 0 plus 1 dimensional QFT, that is in quantum mechanics, has 2 real degrees of freedom. That is my Dirac fermion psi Dirac, which I can write as psi 1, psi 2. Do not confuse this Dirac fermion with the Dirac fermion here. This was the target space discussion. Now I am just in the quantum mechanics. This is the base space fermion. So psi 1 and psi 2, and the Lagrangian of the fermion can be written as I by 2 psi 1 dot plus I by 2 psi 2 dot. Okay, it's a particular choice of gamma 0 matrix gives you this. I don't remember what was my choice. I think this. And now the bosonic action is again half phi dot, where dot means time derivative. And my phi was a real boson only. So now in a supersymmetric system, degrees of freedom of boson and fermions should match, no? So I have supersymmetry. This means for every boson I have corresponding fermions. So the degrees of freedom for bosons and fermions should match both on shell and off shell. So what I mean by on shell means after imposing equation of motion, and off shell means without imposing equation of motion. So when you have to do this degree of freedom counting, you have to do it both on shell and off shell. So let me first do the on shell degree of counting. So on shell means that I impose equation of motion for both phi and psi. So now remember, what is the psi obeys Dirac equation. So a Dirac operator d slash acting on psi will give you some E psi, or if I'm a zero energy state, zero psi. So remember that Dirac operator relates this, you know, from your, there's the sorry, there is a question in the chat. 1 second. Does imposing equation of motion mean to have some boundary conditions pre-assumed? No, even without so in order to solve equation of motion, you need to impose boundary conditions. But I am not solving the equation of motion. I'm just saying, I'm just counting how many degrees of freedom will be removed by the equation of motion, which counting is independent of the boundary conditions. So this so on shell meaning you just count how many degrees of freedom will be removed by equation of motion. So now Dirac operator, if you remember, even in 4D, Dirac, but in 0 plus 1D QF, in 3 plus 1D QFT. So Dirac equation relates two Weyl spinors, no? Relates positive and negative chirality spinors. So basically, so this means that Dirac equation reduces fermionic degrees of freedom to half. Is it clear why Dirac equation reduces fermionic degrees of freedom to half? Because remember, this Dirac operator d slash is an off-diagonal operator. It relates the positive chirality spinor to the negative one and the negative chirality spinor to the positive one. And that's why it reduces fermionic, it makes the fermionic degree of freedom half. So if I count on-shell degrees of freedom, so I had, in the quantum mechanics, the fermion psi had 2 degrees of freedom, but now on shell, that is after imposing Dirac equation, we get one independent fermionic degree of freedom. Now let's come to boson. So let's come to bosonic degrees of freedom. So the bosonic equation of motion, it's a Klein-Gordon equation, no? So bosonic equation of motion, in this case, bosonic equation of motion will be some phi dot is equals to 0. So it tells you about the momentum. It does not reduce the degrees of freedom of phi.
Double dot.
In other words, sorry?
Double dot, no? Phi
Sorry, double dot. Sorry. Phi double. So the bosonic equation of motion doesn't, Klein, my spelling is so horrible. So bosonic equation of motion doesn't reduce degrees of freedom. In other words, you can think of this from the constraint system point of view also. For a boson, momentum and the momentum and the field are both independent degrees of freedom. But for the fermion, momentum and psi are both related. So the bosonic equation of motion doesn't change degrees of freedom. So after imposing equation of motion, that is on shell, we still have one real bosonic degree of freedom. So consider, so the system with one Dirac fermion and one real boson have equal fermionic and bosonic degree of freedom on shell. Is this clear that on shell the bosonic and fermionic degrees of freedom match? Any question?
Any question? Because usually we don't do this on shell and off shell counting. So if some of you have question, please ask. It's a very important point. Okay, I cannot see any question.
Okay, now let's go to off shell counting. So off shell, that is without imposing equation of motion. So without imposing equation of motion, the fermions, I had 2 real degrees of freedom because it was a Dirac fermion, and the boson had only 1. So they don't match. So what will you do? So in order for the off shell degrees of freedom to match, we add an auxiliary bosonic field F such that it is 0 when you set, such that it is non-dynamical, that is it's 0 and it is 0 once you impose equation of motion. So it doesn't contribute in on shell degrees of freedom counting. So in order for the off shell degrees of freedom to match, we usually add an auxiliary field which I will denote by F. This is a bosonic field. So now I will have 2 real bosons, phi and F, and this field we have to add this. The Lagrangian of this field will be such that it is 0 when you impose equation of motion. So it does not contribute to the on shell degrees of freedom counting because on shell we already matched degrees of freedom. So the Lagrangian of F is usually chosen as half F square. So the equation of motion will just be F is equals to 0. So now what I have? So I have a bosonic field phi. So what is my system? Bosonic field phi. Real fermion psi 1 and psi 2. These two form a Dirac fermion. Psi 1 and psi 2 together form a Dirac fermion. And then I have a auxiliary field F. This is auxiliary. Auxiliary meaning it's non-dynamical. And this thing is called a supersymmetry multiplet. So supersymmetry multiplet is basically a representation of supersymmetry algebra. So what you have, so now the bosonic and fermionic degrees of freedom match both on shell and off shell. And what will, so the full Lagrangian for n is equals to 1 system will be, notice I haven't told you till now that it's a n equal to 1 system. Now I will write the Lagrangian and I will write the SUSY variations. From there you can see that it's invariant under 2 real supercharges. I'm just writing n equal to 1 without actually showing that it's invariant under 2 real supercharges. So the full Lagrangian L is half pi dot square plus I by 2 psi 1 dot plus I by 2 psi 2 dot plus half F square. And you can check so what you can check that delta phi I is I epsilon 1. Oh, sorry, I'm using phi I, so I have n fields. Psi I, there will be then n auxiliary field Fi. I runs from 1 to n. Epsilon 1 psi I 2 plus psi 1 I epsilon 2 delta psi 2 I is equals to minus pi dot I epsilon 1 plus Fi epsilon 2 delta psi 1 I is equals to phi dot I epsilon 2 plus Fi epsilon 1 delta F is equals to minus I epsilon 1 psi 1 dot I plus epsilon 2 psi 2 dot I. So please do this check. Please check that the Lagrangian L is invariant under these supersymmetry transformations. Notice that I am writing psi1 and psi and epsilon in particular orders. This order is important because psi's and epsilons anti-commute. So if instead of this I wrote epsilon to psi1, I should have written with a negative sign. So the order is important. So do these variations and check that the Lagrangian is invariant under this transformation. Where now epsilon 1 and epsilon 2 are two real parameters. Since you have two real parameters, two real parameters under which the Lagrangian is invariant, so you will have two real supercharges. So this, the above Lagrangian is invariant under n is equals to 1 SUSY. So as a homework, check SUSY variations and compute Noether charges. Compute Noether charges, you will find there is a one complex or two real Noether charges. So that's why you will find that it's invariant under n is equals to 1 supersymmetry. Any questions?
Ma'am, why we have to check it at both on cell and y off cell? Why these both conditions have to be satisfied?
Because it's a supersymmetric. So I say that a symmetry is there in the system. The symmetry should be there in the system independent of whether you have imposed equation of motion or not, because it's the symmetry of the whole Lagrangian. And if you say that you see that symmetry only after imposing equation of motion, then you are restricting. Then it's not the symmetry of the whole Lagrangian. The whole Lagrangian is valid everywhere, no? So in other words, when you do a path integral, no? When you compute a partition function, you do not impose that your fields are obeying equation of motion. You integrate over all possible fields. So since you want your symmetry to be there for all possible values of phi, so for all possible values of the Lagrangian, you want to say that the degrees of freedom should match off shell. And on shell, so after imposing equation of motion, you should not get rid of the symmetry because you don't want symmetry to break after imposing equation of motion. So you want it to match on shell as well.
Okay, I understand that, but what is then the significance of the auxiliary field, or does it really plays no significance in our theory?
So it's there to match degrees of freedom. There are different types of auxiliary field. So this type of auxiliary field F actually doesn't contribute anything to the equation of motion. Is just there as a calculation purpose. But then there is another auxiliary field which occurs when you write down supersymmetric Lagrangians for vectors for A mu, the vector field. The auxiliary field there plays an important role in some of the things. I am not covering that in the lectures. And also, second thing is, when I am writing the supersymmetry Lagrangian, I am just writing down the Lagrangian. There is another way to derive those Lagrangians, which is from superspace formalism. And once you do the superspace formalisms, then you will need auxiliary fields in order to write down. So writing down supersymmetry Lagrangians is very easy, becomes very easy once you go to this superspace formalism. And there you need auxiliary fields to write down your full superfield. So superspace formalism is like you put all the fields of this multiplet, the supersymmetry multiplet, combined together in certain way to write it as one field. So you define some field capital phi such that which is a combination of all these fields, and then you write the Lagrangian as a kinetic term in capital phi. So if you write some derivative of phi term, you will get all the four terms of the Lagrangian. I am not doing this superspace formalism. So in order to do this superspace formalism, you need the auxiliary field. And once you go to this, so it's a useful mathematical tool.
Okay.
Ananda, am I missing any other?
Yeah, I would add to that. Since they have not done path integral, let me say in the QFT1 language. So when you do loop amplitude computation, things running in the loops, they do not satisfy on-shell condition. Okay, so if you want to see supersymmetry at the loop level, then those states, they do not satisfy any on-shell condition. All the states run in the loops, right? So that's also in that case, you will see if you try to do loop computation, and if you want to see various properties of supersymmetry, you will see these auxiliary fields are running in the loop to ensure supersymmetry. Okay, yeah, it's important, because when you do quantum field theory or even quantum mechanics, when you do any quantum correction, those things do not necessarily satisfy classical equation of motion. Does it help, Dibojyoti?
So sir, in the mean that the auxiliary field really comes in our calculation, like it really affects our calculation in some way.
Yes.
I mean, not just there to preserve the
in the loops. So you will see the structure of the auxiliary field. It happens to be, you should work out these details, that they always come in quadratic in the actions. So they will run in the loops. So in the tree level, as far as I know, they do not play any role. So you can completely ignore them. The moment you go to loops, they will actually have propagators and everything. Okay.
Okay. Now let me, since there are only 8 minutes left, I want to cover two concepts. One is central extension. Okay, so I just wrote down supersymmetry Lagrangian for n is equals to 1 case. Similarly, you can go and write down for n is equals to 2, n is equals to 3, up to so on. So let me, what is central extension? So remember what was our SUSY algebra? So my SUSY algebra was Q dagger is Hamiltonian, and QQ itself and Q dagger itself with themselves is 0. But now if you have multiple Qs, if we have more supersymmetry, so we have multiple supercharges. Let me denote them by Qi, and I'm writing alpha also because it's a fermionic operator, so it will have a spinor index. It has a spinor index. I was avoiding to write the spinor index in the quantum mechanics case because I know the spinor will have two components. So I was just writing as when I was taking one n is equals to half supersymmetry, then there was only one real supercharge. So I was writing as Q. In this case, you can write it as Q1 and Q2, and this 1 and 2 are your alpha indices basically. So if you have and I goes from 1 to n, depending on how much supersymmetry you have in the system. And now, what will the SUSY algebra? Qi alpha, Qj beta will give you some sigma alpha beta. The sigma is there to for this alpha beta indices. H times delta ij, sigma 0. We usually choose this to be identity matrix. So I think, and now Q itself had to be Q with Q itself had to be 0. So Qi has to be 0, but Qj can give you some other non-zero quantity, no? So now I can have a commutator that is Qi alpha, Qj beta. So what can appear on the right hand side? So the thing which will appear on the right hand side, let me write it as epsilon alpha beta Zij. With epsilon alpha beta, it's antisymmetric in alpha beta indices. And now this Zij should be such that the diagonal components Zi should be 0. Why? Because we know Qi should give me 0 because of the SUSY algebra. But it can have non-zero off diagonal components. No? And now also, so it can have non-zero off diagonal components. Now also this commutator, it is symmetric under exchange of Qi alpha and Qj beta. That is Qi alpha Qj beta is equal to Qj beta Qi alpha. This is the definition of the anti-commutator, no? Because anti-commutator comes with a positive sign in between. So this should be true. Now what is this? I am writing this as epsilon alpha beta Zij. Here it will be epsilon beta alpha Zji. Now epsilon was antisymmetric in alpha and beta. So this is minus of epsilon alpha beta. I cancel this from both sides. So what I get, that Zij is basically an antisymmetric matrix. So Zij is antisymmetric. So this relation is called the central extension. This is called central extension of SUSY algebra. And these Zi's, the matrix, these Zij's are called central charges. And these Zij's commute with the Hamiltonian. So these are conserved. So central charge is conserved. It's a conserved quantity. So this is known as, so when you have more than one supersymmetry, you can extend the supersymmetric algebra to introduce new charges, which are called central charges. And these central charges are conserved quantities of your system. You could have a system in which central charge was 0, but you can have a non-zero central charge as well. Okay, so this is called the central extension of a supersymmetry algebra. Look, I am introducing all these concepts in quantum mechanics. When you go to supersymmetric quantum field theories, all these concepts make just extend to the supersymmetric quantum field theory, and these play an important role. Then there is another concept which I wanted to introduce, is something called, is the central charge clear? Why it should be antisymmetric? Is it clear? Okay. Let me now come to something called R symmetry. So now the Lagrangian which I wrote down had supersymmetry as its symmetry, but the Lagrangian, let's consider the Lagrangian. Which has some other global symmetry along with supersymmetry. So let's say I had some other global symmetry. Let me consider U1 symmetry, EI alpha phi. If I do this transformation, my Lagrangian was invariant. Global means this alpha is a constant. So if I had some, let's say, other global symmetry along with supersymmetry, so my Lagrangian is invariant under this global symmetry plus supersymmetry. Now, this global symmetry can be of two types. One, it commutes with SUSY. It commutes with supercharges. So if TL is a global symmetry, is the generator of this global symmetry, TL is generator of global symmetry. If I take its commutator with Q, Qi alpha, I will get 0. But I could have another type of global symmetry which does not commute with supersymmetry.
So the first case is the central charge, right?
Yeah, but you can have other type of global symmetries also.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is the R symmetry, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Which does not commute.
Sorry, I don't understand how is the first case the central charge? I mean, central charge is not necessarily a global symmetry of the field, right?
Yes, it is. Sorry, Diksha, do you disagree? I mean, my understanding is that it is because it commutes with the Hamiltonian.
Yeah, it commutes
Yes.
with the Hamiltonian, but what is its effect on the fields of the theory?
It
No,
will
you-
be
sorry.
some. Sorry, Diksha first. Yes. No. Yeah.
No, so these central charges could have been the charges corresponding to some global symmetry. So usually that is the case. Usually when you consider a supersymmetric system, the things that appear on this central charges, it's a conserved quantity. So it has to be related to some symmetry, no? So it's related to some global symmetry of your Lagrangian. But
Yeah.
you could have another global symmetries also which do not appear here in the central term.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the global symmetries are not necessarily the central charges, right?
Yeah,
No,
but the
global
other way
symmetries
around
are
is true.
Other way around is true. Yes.
Oh, the central charges are necessarily some sort of global symmetries which commute with Q. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Then you have another type of global symmetry which do not commute with supercharges. That is the symmetry generator TL into some Qi alpha is non-zero. Such symmetries are called R symmetry. And these symmetries are usually very useful in when you write down the supersymmetry multiplet. So in a what these symmetries means in terms of the supersymmetry multiplet. In a supersymmetry multiplet, if you have any global symmetry, all the fields of this multiplet will have the same charge under that global symmetry. But if that global symmetry is an R symmetry, then the fields of this then fields sitting in the same multiplet can have different charges under this R symmetry, since it does not commute with the supercharge. Is it clear? So there are some things in the chat box which
Diksha, I think if anyone has a question, they can just unmute and ask you.
Yeah.
Please unmute yourself. If your question is for Diksha, please unmute yourself and ask.
Hello.
Yes.
So my question was, sorry, it is a bit late. It was related to the previous part on F being an auxiliary quantity.
Yes.
So F being non-dynamical, is it to ensure that the time derivative would go to zero when you vary the action?
No. So the equation of motion of F is zero. It's not only the time derivative of F goes to zero. It's F is itself zero. And why this type of action is there for F? Because F should not contribute anything to the on-shell degrees of freedom. So on-shell it vanishes.
F has no time derivative. The action has no time derivative of F.
Yeah. The action of F doesn't have any time derivative. It's just F square by 2.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other question?
Yeah, question on definitions. Are the R symmetries always defined to be unitary, or can they be anti-unitary also?
Okay. Now that I don't know.
I don't think it is. I don't think it can be anti-unitary actually. I'm not very sure, but I think R symmetry is always, it's a continuous symmetry, right? So if it's a continuous symmetry, yes, if it's a continuous symmetry, then it cannot be anti-unitary.
No, but maybe the question is, why should they be continuous? Like, can I think of a permutation of supercharges which is anti-linear? Some discrete symmetry, for example.
So you're thinking of supercharges to be discrete symmetry?
No. Permutation of supercharges to be a discrete symmetry.
Permutation of supercharges too.
Oh, okay.
Well, then you have to check that whether it is consistent with the supersymmetry algebra and whether it puts any condition on the
Jacobi's also needs to be satisfied, right? All the Jacobi's also needs to be satisfied. So
yes.
And two supercharges should give you momenta. So I think there can be some issues. by bringing in a discrete symmetry there.
So I think only symmetries which can square to 1 can be antilinear, anti-unitary. Any symmetry which doesn't square to 1 cannot be. So even if you have a set of discrete symmetry which forms a group, then it cannot become antilinear, anti-unitary, because it's not consistent with the group algebra. Okay.
I don't quite see that, but
Okay. I'm saying that let's say you have some group where all the generators of the group in the same footing, and if say a squares to b, right? So if a is antilinear, then a square should be linear unitary, right?
sure.
But we said that the full group is antilinear. So how b can be a linear unitary?
No, I'm just thinking of supersymmetric quantum mechanics, where there are
Yes.
two supercharges.
Yes.
Some antilinear symmetry just exchanges the two supercharges.
Yeah, which then it will square to 1. That
Yes.
can be, I think, antilinear.
Yeah, that's the example here.
Yes, but
Is
if
it
you
a
have
matter of
more,
definition that such things are not called R symmetry or something? Or?
I
No,
don't
then
know.
I think you might have to check whether under such symmetry the things appearing in the same supersymmetry multiplet, if they have different charges. So if phi has a different charge under this type of R symmetry, and psi 1 has a different charge than phi. If that is the case, then maybe it can be called R symmetry, because the definition of R symmetry, which I know, is basically a symmetry which does not commute with the supercharge.
Maybe Abhishek, you can tell, is there any reason to consider such things? Is it important? Because asymmetries has also some importance in some high energy thing, I mean, it plays some roles, right? So if you have such a discrete symmetry, does it appear naturally somewhere?
I mean, I wrote a paper recently where I found that, so I was wondering whether.
Okay, we should
it
read
was
your
for a
paper then.
purely selfish reason I'm asking.
Okay.
Okay, I actually, yeah, I don't know that.
Yeah,
Okay, so I think we are running out of time. In the last, I wanted to tell you some other applications of supersymmetry, so that if somebody is interested, can read. I'll just mention the names. If somebody is interested, can ask for references, can email me and ask Navmita Di or Arnabla or any of the faculty there for the references on those. I'm just mentioning.
They can ask anyone. Doesn't have to be all of us.
Yeah, anyone. Sorry. So some of the applications, one is that when you have a supersymmetric system, if you want to compute partition functions, supersymmetric partition functions, there is a technique called localization, which helps you to compute the supersymmetric partition functions, and you can compute those partition functions exactly. If you can compute a partition function exactly, you know everything about the system. So supersymmetry is a very powerful tool, because for supersymmetric systems, sometimes you can use this technique called localization, and you can compute the full partition function. You can understand the basic concept of localization just in quantum mechanics as well. Refer to this mirror symmetry book, chapter 10. Chapter 10, instead of calling localization, they call it deformation invariance. And they give in chapter 10, they give the example in a supersymmetric quantum mechanics, how localization works and how you can exactly solve the path integral. So if somebody is interested, look into this. Second is,
Diksha,
yes?
I think many of us will be interested, and we are again going to bother you after some few months.
Yeah, it will be fine.
That's exactly the thing I had in mind also.
No, localization, I could have just given one more lecture on localization. Localization will not take much time, at least if you want to consider.
I think let people digest this some more. Let them sink it, and then at some point later, that's better.
Yeah. And also, also supersymmetric partition functions. These partition functions appear in black hole microstate countings. So I am now saying some words which a lot of you might not be familiar with. I'm just saying that to tell you that there are a lot of other applications of the things we just studied. And if somebody is interested, you can also look into these things. So these supersymmetric partition function are useful in black hole microstate counting for supersymmetric black holes. And since one can compute these partition functions using localization, people have been able to compute, have been able to reproduce black hole entropy using black hole entropy by counting microstates.
And till now, this is the only method we are aware of, right?
Yeah. So till now, the only so if entropy, we know thermodynamic black hole entropy is given by area by 4. This is the area of the horizon. So I'm taking G, C, H, because all the constants should be 1. So this is the black hole entropy. This was computed by Bekenstein and Hawking. But now any quantum theory of gravity should be able to reproduce this thermodynamic entropy by counting the degrees of freedom. If you have done the statistical mechanics course, you know that the entropy is log of number of degrees of freedom. So if you have a quantum theories, if you have a microscopic description, you should be able to count these degrees of freedom, take a log, and you should be able to show that this thing is proportional to the area. And people have been able to do this only using string theory and only for the supersymmetric black holes. So this is one of the main reason why people say that string theory is one of the only contenders for quantum gravity which has reproduced black hole entropy, because they use the supersymmetric partition functions to compute this entropy. And they have computed it for a lot of different types of black holes, and people have been able to show that it's proportional to area and also find corrections to this. So it's a very important result for in string theory. Okay. And also, till now, what I was writing free Lagrangians, in the sense that I didn't add any potential term. These were just kinetic terms. So if you have a potential, you can write down the Lagrangian, a supersymmetric Lagrangian, you can with a superpotential. I didn't cover that in the lectures, but this is also there in this mirror symmetry book, chapter 10. You can find the Lagrangians with superpotentials as well. Okay, I think I can end here. So any questions for like till now, whatever we have covered, or if you have questions afterwards also, you can write to me or ask any of the faculty there.
Yeah, any other question? I mean, I think we ended at a very good note with many open directions and everything, so that's great. So any other question? Okay, let's thank Diksha for giving these 5 lectures. It's not easy. So yeah, thank you. And we'll probably catch you at some point later again. Okay. And let me announce